He mocked her with a smile. "Sing this, and I'll give you $100 million. But when the maid's daughter opened her mouth, the impossible happened and shocked everyone. "She's the maid's daughter," someone whispered. "What's she even doing here?" At Northwood Academy, music was royalty, and power sang in moneyed tones. Among prodigies and heirs, one girl dared to believe a voice could be enough. "I'll give you $100 million if you can sing this," the world's most celebrated singer laughed. Cameras flashed. The room echoed with disbelief. No one knew that behind the silence of polished floors and gilded halls, a song was waiting. One older, truer, stronger than any fame could buy. What began as a cruel challenge would ignite a reckoning. What started as laughter ended as legend. This is the story of how a forgotten voice rose from the shadows of marble floors and changed the meaning of music forever. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. He offered $100 million for a song he thought she could never sing. This was the whisper that echoed through the marble halls of the world's most exclusive music school. The story was about a man who had everything, and a little girl who had nothing but a voice. The Northwood Academy of Music was not a school. It was a kingdom. Its walls were built from old money and new ambition. Its lawns were manicured with the precision of a surgeon. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting colored light on floors so polished you could see your reflection. The students who walked these halls were not ordinary children. They were Montgomerys, Vanderbilts, and Changs, the heirs to fortunes and dynasties. They carried violins worth more than houses and wore shoes that cost more than a teacher's monthly salary. And every day, Laura Hayes cleaned the floors they walked on. Laura was a ghost in this kingdom of splendor. She moved through the hallways with a quiet grace, her cart of cleaning supplies gliding silently beside her. She polished the brass plaques honoring famous alumni and wiped the dust from grand pianos that had been played by legends. She was invisible, and that was how the Academy liked it. The staff were meant to be efficient, silent, and unseen. Her daughter, 10-year-old Abigail, was even more invisible. Abby, with her pale blonde hair that seemed to catch the light and eyes the color of a summer sky, lived with her mother in a small staff apartment tucked away behind the Academy's kitchens. It was a simple, clean space that always smelled faintly of bleach and freshly baked bread from the cafeteria. Their world was a stark contrast to the opulence just 100 yards away. While other students learned about Italian arias and German composers, Abby learned how to sort laundry and scrub floors without leaving streaks. But Abby had a secret. When the grand halls were empty and the last echoes of a cello or a soprano had faded into the night, she would stand in the middle of the main auditorium. Alone in the vast, silent dark, she would sing. She didn't sing the complex pieces she overheard from the practice rooms. She sang the simple, old songs her mother had taught her. Songs that spoke of rolling hills, of love and loss, of a quiet strength that felt like home. Her voice was not loud or powerful. It was clear and pure, like water from a mountain spring. It filled the empty hall not with force, but with a feeling, a deep, resonant emotion that seemed to hang in the air long after the note was gone. She never let anyone hear her. The fear of being discovered, of being laughed at, was a constant weight in her small chest. Here, you were either a prodigy or you were nobody. And she was the daughter of the maid. She was less than nobody. One crisp autumn morning, a buzz of excitement rippled through the Academy. A series of large, elegant posters appeared on the velvet-lined bulletin boards. The Elite Voice Challenge. The announcement was for the Academy's most prestigious annual event. It was a vocal competition unlike any other. The prize was a full, all-expenses-paid scholarship to Northwood, a recording contract, and a staggering $100 million in sponsorships and endowments. It was not just a prize, it was a new life. And this year, the final judge was the legendary Julian Croft. Julian Croft was Northwood's greatest success story. A global superstar with a voice that critics said could make angels weep, he was a god in the world of music. He was also an alumnus of the Academy, and his return as a judge was a momentous occasion. He was known for his perfectionism, his sharp tongue, and his utter intolerance for anything less than brilliance. His presence electrified the students. To win was to be crowned by the king himself. In the grand dining hall, the chatter was deafening. My parents have already hired the best vocal coach from Milan, announced Isabella Montgomery, a girl with fiery red hair and a perpetual smirk. Her father owned a media empire. Julian Croft loves classical crossover. I'll be singing Nessun Dorma. My mother is designing my dress, added another student. It's covered in real Swarovski crystals. Abby sat at a small, secluded table in the corner, where the staff's children were allowed to eat after the main student body had finished. She listened to the boasts and the plans, her heart a tangled knot of longing and impossibility. She imagined herself walking onto that stage, the bright lights on her face. She could almost feel the hush of the crowd, the thrill of that first note. It was a beautiful, painful dream. A dream for other girls, in other lives. That evening, as she helped her mother polish the immense glass trophy case in the main lobby, Abby stared at the grand prize from last year. It was a crystal statue of a songbird in flight. Her own reflection looked back at her from the glass. A small, serious girl in a faded hand-me-down dress. It's beautiful, isn't it? Laura said softly, following her daughter's gaze. Abby nodded, her throat tight. The winner gets a new life. Laura stopped polishing and knelt beside her daughter. She gently tucked a stray strand of blonde hair behind Abby's ear. You have a beautiful voice, Abigail. A voice that tells stories. That's a gift. But I'm not like them, Mom, Abby whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know all those fancy songs. I don't have a crystal dress. Laura pulled her daughter into a warm hug, the familiar scent of lavender soap a comfort to Abby. You have something they don't, she said, her voice firm but gentle. You have heart. When you sing with your whole soul. That's more valuable than any crystal. Later that night, long after her mother had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Abby lay awake, the words of the students echoing in her mind. They're looking for a star. You need a perfect technique. She's the maid's daughter. What could she possibly do? But then, she heard her mother's voice in her head. You have heart. With a sudden surge of courage that felt both terrifying and thrilling, Abby slipped out of bed. She crept through the silent, moonlit corridors of the academy, her bare feet making no sound on the cold marble floors. She made her way to the administrative office, where a single light burned over the reception desk. The sign-up sheet for the Elite Voice Challenge was on a clipboard. The list was already long, filled with elegant, confident signatures. Isabella Montgomery, Alexander Chun, Sophia Vanderbilt. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. For a moment, she almost turned back. The fear was a cold hand gripping her heart. But then she thought of her mother's tired hands, of their tiny apartment, of the dream she held so tightly in the secret corners of her heart. She took a deep breath. In small, neat letters at the very bottom of the list, she wrote her name. Abigail Hayes. She didn't write her instrument or her song choice. She just wrote her name. It was enough. As she scurried back to her room, she felt a profound sense of both dread and triumph. She had stepped out of the shadows. Now, she would have to face the light. The next day, the discovery of her name on the list was met not with applause, but with ridicule. Abigail Hayes. Isabella Montgomery shrieked with laughter, pointing at the clipboard for her friends to see. The cleaner's girl? Is she going to sing a song about mopping the floors? Her friends howled in delight. Maybe her talent is scrubbing toilets in perfect rhythm, one of them added. The laughter followed Abby down the hall. Every cruel word was a tiny, sharp stone hitting her. She kept her head down, her face burning with shame, and pretended not to hear. But the words burrowed deep inside her. For the rest of the day, she stayed hidden away in the apartment, refusing to come out. She told her mother she felt sick. Laura knew better. She found Abby curled up on her small bed, clutching a pillow. Laura sat down beside her, not saying a word for a long time. She simply rested a hand on Abby's back. They think I'm a joke, Abby mumbled into the pillow. What they think doesn't change the truth of who you are, Laura said softly. Their words are just noise. Your voice is music. She began to hum a simple, haunting melody. It was a song Abby had known her whole life, a lullaby her mother sang to her every night. It was an old song, one her grandfather used to sing. Mom, Abby asked, her voice small. What song is that really? Laura's expression grew distant, a sad, proud light in her eyes. That was your grandfather's song, she explained. He was a soldier a long time ago, a great man. He used to say that this song was a soldier's lullaby. It was a reminder of what he was fighting for home, for peace, for a quiet place to rest. She looked directly into Abby's eyes. He was the bravest man I ever knew, Abby. And he never, ever let anyone tell him who he was or what he was worth. That bravery is in your blood. Don't you ever forget it. That night, Abby didn't just hear the song. She felt it. She felt the courage of the man she'd never met. She thought about his bravery and her mother's quiet, tireless strength. She realized her mother was a warrior, too, fighting her own battles every day with a mop and a bucket and an unbreakable spirit. The preliminary auditions were held a week later in one of the smaller recital halls. It was not the grand auditorium, but it was still intimidating. The room had dark wood paneling and a row of stern-faced preliminary judges, 3 of the Academy's senior music teachers. The students who went before Abby were a parade of polished perfection. They had backing tracks on expensive devices. They had perfectly rehearsed movements. Isabella Montgomery performed her Italian aria with technical flawlessness, hitting every high note with piercing accuracy. The judges nodded, impressed, making notes on their pads. When the stage manager called, Abigail Hayes, a few snickers rippled through the waiting area. Abby walked onto the stage. She wore a simple white dress her mother had sewn for her from an old tablecloth. It was clean and neat, but next to the designer outfits of the other contestants, it looked like a pauper's gown. Her hands were cold and clammy. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stood in the center of the stage, a tiny, solitary figure. "Do you have a backing track, dear?" asked one of the judges, a woman with severe-looking glasses. "No, ma'am," Abby said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll be singing a cappella." The judge sighed, a look of impatience on her face. Another judge looked at his watch. They were already behind schedule. Abby closed her eyes, shutting out the skeptical faces and the intimidating room. She took a deep breath and thought of her mother. She thought of the grandfather she never knew. She thought of his song. And then she began to sing. The sun sinks low behind the hill. It was just her voice. No piano, no orchestra, no grand production. It was raw, unadorned, and utterly sincere. The melody of the soldier's lullaby filled the room. It wasn't a performance. It was a prayer. Her voice didn't soar to the rafters like Isabella's had. Instead, it reached out to each person in the room, a gentle, insistent touch on the heart. It spoke of weariness and hope, of fear and courage. The room, which had been restless moments before, fell completely still. The judge who had been looking at his watch slowly put his arm down. The woman with the severe glasses lowered her pen. They weren't just listening to a song. They were feeling a story. They saw the images her voice painted, a soldier far from home, a mother humming to her child, the quiet promise of a new day. When the final note faded into silence, no one spoke. The quiet was profound, heavy with unspoken emotion. The judges just stared at the small girl on the stage, their professional composure momentarily shattered. They had heard hundreds of technically perfect auditions. They had not heard anything so real in years. Finally, the head judge cleared his throat. He looked down at his notes, then back up at Abby, his eyes holding a new respect. "Thank you, Abigail," he said, his voice softer than before. "You may go." As Abby walked off the stage, she heard Isabella whisper to her friend, "What was that? Some boring old folk song? The judges must be going deaf." But Abby didn't care. For the first time, she hadn't been singing for them. She had been singing for herself. The list of semi-finalists was posted the next morning. Abby scanned the names, her heart pounding. And there, at the very bottom, was her own. Abigail Hayes. She had made it. A small, joyful gasp escaped her lips. Her victory, however, only made her a bigger target. Isabella and her friends were furious. To them, it was an insult that the maid's daughter had advanced while other, more deserving students had been cut. Their bullying became more direct. One afternoon, as Abby was walking through the courtyard, Isabella and 2 of her friends cornered her. "I can't believe they let you through," Isabella sneered, blocking her path. "My father is a major donor to this school. I could have you and your mother thrown out of here with one phone call." "Leave her alone, Isabella," a quiet voice said. They all turned. Leaning against a nearby oak tree was Mr. Henderson, the Academy's old groundskeeper. He was a man of few words, with hands weathered from decades of work and kind, knowing eyes. He held a pair of pruning shears. Isabella scoffed. "And who are you?" The gardener? Stay out of this. I've been working at this academy since before you were born, little miss, Mr. Henderson said, his voice calm but firm. He took a step forward. Long enough to know that talent isn't about the name you carry. It's about the heart you have. He looked pointedly at Isabella. Something money can't buy. Isabella, flustered and angry at being challenged by a staff member, shot him a venomous look before storming off with her friends. Abby looked up at Mr. Henderson, her eyes wide with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. He gave her a gentle smile. Don't you mind them, little one. Your singing, it reminds me of someone I used to know. A good man. He paused, looking off into the distance. General William Hayes. Your grandfather. Abby's eyes widened. You knew him? I did, Mr. Henderson said, a fond memory playing on his lips. I served under his command a long time ago. He was a hero, but he was also a humble man. He used to sing that same song you sang. He told us it kept the fear at bay. It reminded us what we were fighting for. He looked back at Abby, his gaze piercing. You have his spirit in you. Don't let anyone ever dim that light. His words were a shield. They wrapped around Abby, protecting her from the doubt and the fear. She wasn't just the maid's daughter anymore. She was the granddaughter of a hero, and she had his song to sing. The semifinals were a grander affair. They were held in the main auditorium, the same one where Abby used to sing in secret. For the first time, Julian Croft himself was present, seated in the center of the judges' table. He sat with an air of bored royalty, his handsome face a mask of cool indifference. His reputation preceded him. A single, dismissive wave of his hand could end a career. One by one, the semi-finalists performed. They sang with power and precision, their voices filling the magnificent hall. Julian offered curt, cutting feedback. Too much vibrato. No emotional connection. Technically perfect, but utterly boring. When Abby's name was called, a murmur went through the audience of students and faculty. Julian Croft raised an eyebrow, looking down at his program. Abigail Hayes, he said into his microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. No listed accompaniment. Another a cappella folk song, I presume. Abby walked to the center of the stage, her small body trembling under the immense weight of his gaze. The bright lights made it impossible to see anyone in the crowd, except for the silhouette of the famous singer at the judges' table. She nodded. Yes, sir. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. How quaint. Proceed. Abby took a shaky breath and began to sing The Soldier's Lullaby once more. She poured every ounce of her newfound courage into the song. She sang for her mother, for Mr. Henderson, and for the grandfather she carried in her heart. Her voice, pure and unwavering, cut through the tense atmosphere of the auditorium. For a moment, there was that same magical silence. The story in her voice was undeniable. Two of the other judges were visibly moved, their critical facades melting away. But Julian Croft remained impassive. He tapped his pen on the table, his expression one of pure boredom. When she finished, he was the first to speak. Well, he said, his voice amplified throughout the hall. That was sweet. A sweet little song for a sweet little girl. He looked at her, but his eyes were cold and dismissive. This is the Elite Voice Challenge. Miss Hayes, not a campfire sing-along. We are looking for a global superstar, not a history lesson. Your voice has a certain purity, I suppose, but it lacks training, power, and sophistication. It is, in a word, unremarkable. Each word was a physical blow. Abby felt the air leave her lungs. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The cruelty was palpable. She managed to scrape through to the finals, thanks to the passionate defense of the other two judges who argued that her raw emotional connection was a rare gift. But Julian Croft's public dismissal had done its damage. He had marked her as an unworthy charity case. The real confrontation came 2 days later. Abby was in the music library, trying to find a book on breathing techniques, when Isabella and her mother, a formidable woman named Victoria Montgomery, entered. Julian Croft was with them. They were laughing and talking like old friends. Julian, darling, you were absolutely right about that little. What's her name? Victoria said with a dismissive wave of her hand. The maid's daughter. She simply doesn't belong here. Julian Croft smiled. Talent without polish is just noise, Victoria. The girl is a novelty, nothing more. He then turned and saw Abby standing frozen by a bookshelf. His eyes narrowed, but his smile didn't falter. It became even crueler. He walked over to a glass case displaying rare musical artifacts. Inside was an original, handwritten score from a notoriously difficult 18th-century Italian opera. He pointed to the complex cascade of notes on the yellowed parchment. "You see this, little girl?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the library to hear. "This is music. This is art. This requires a lifetime of dedication and training." He turned to her, his smirk widening into a grin of pure arrogance. "Forget your dusty old lullabies," he declared, a theatrical flourish in his voice. "You walk onto that stage at the finals and sing that aria. Sing it perfectly." He paused for dramatic effect, then let out a short, sharp laugh. "Sing this, and I'll give you the $100 million myself." Isabella and her mother roared with laughter. It was a joke, a cruel, public humiliation. He wasn't making an offer. He was making a statement. He was telling her, and the entire world, that she was so far beneath him, so utterly out of her league, that the idea of her succeeding was a laughable fantasy. Abby stood there, unable to move, her face ashen. The laughter of the world's most famous singer echoed in her ears, a sound of mockery and absolute power. In that moment, he hadn't just insulted her voice. He had crushed her soul. Abby didn't run. To run would be to make a sound, to draw more attention. Instead, she simply turned and walked away, each step a monumental effort of will. She kept her back straight and her head high, but she couldn't stop the hot tears that blurred the world into a painful, watery mess. The sound of their laughter followed her, bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the library, chasing her down the long, silent corridors. It was a cruel, echoing sound that seemed to seep into the very stones of the academy. She didn't stop walking until she reached the heavy service door that led to the staff quarters. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the polished, opulent world of the academy, her composure crumbled. She collapsed against the cool metal, her body racked with sobs that she choked back, terrified someone might hear. She made it to their small two-room apartment and went straight to her room, a space so tiny that her bed, a small desk, and a wardrobe nearly touched. She curled into a tight ball on her quilt, burying her face in her pillow to muffle the sound of her heartbreak. The dream was over. It had been foolish to ever think she belonged. Julian Croft's laughter wasn't just about a song. It was a judgment on her entire existence. She was the maid's daughter, a speck of dust in a world of gold. He had looked at her and seen nothing of value, and in that moment, she believed him. When Laura came home hours later, the sun had already set. She was bone-tired, her shoulders aching from a long day of scrubbing and polishing. She walked into the apartment, expecting to find Abby practicing or reading, but the main room was dark and silent. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. "Abby," she called softly. There was no answer. She found her daughter in bed, still in her day clothes, her face pale and tear-stained. The pillow was damp. Laura's heart broke. She knew, without having to ask, that this was about more than just childish sadness. This was a deep wound. She sat on the edge of the bed and gently stroked Abby's hair. "What happened, sweetheart?" Abby's voice was a ragged whisper. "He laughed at me, Mom, in front of everyone. He said I was nothing. He told me to sing some impossible song, and he laughed." Laura listened, her expression slowly changing. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a fire, a quiet, controlled fury that was more powerful than any shout. She had spent her life being invisible, swallowing her pride, and enduring the casual condescension of the wealthy people she served. She did it all for Abby, to give her a chance at a world that had always been closed to people like them. To hear that the king of that world had used his power to crush her daughter's spirit was an unbearable injustice. When Abby finished her story, hiccuping through the final, humiliating details, Laura stood up. She didn't say, "It's okay," or "Don't listen to him." Instead, she walked over to a small wooden chest at the foot of her own bed. It was old and plain, but it was the one thing she treasured most in the world. She opened the lid. The scent of cedar and old paper filled the small room. She reached inside and carefully lifted out a worn leather-bound journal and a small, velvet-covered box. "Come here, Abigail," she said, her voice devoid of its usual softness. It was strong, resonant. "Sit down. There are some things you need to know." Abby slowly sat up, wiping her eyes. Laura sat beside her on the bed and opened the journal. The pages were filled with elegant, faded handwriting. "This was your grandfather's," Laura began. "William Hayes was not born a general. He was born in a dusty town in Oklahoma, the son of a sharecropper. He had nothing, less than we have now. When he was a boy, people looked at his patched-up clothes and his empty pockets, and they saw nothing, just like Mr. Croft looked at you today." She turned a page, showing Abby a pressed four-leaf clover tucked between the pages. "But your grandfather knew his worth wasn't in his wallet. It was in his character. He joined the army with nothing but a desire to be part of something bigger than himself. And he learned that respect isn't given to the loudest voice in the room, but to the steadiest hand and the truest heart." Laura then opened the small velvet box. Inside, resting on faded silk, was a medal. It wasn't shiny or grand. It was simple, bronze, and etched with the image of an eagle. It was the Distinguished Service Cross. "He earned this for walking into enemy fire to save 3 of his men," Laura said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was terrified. He wrote about it in his journal. He said he kept humming a little tune to keep his legs from giving out. A simple tune his own mother used to sing to him when he was scared of the dark." She looked at Abby, her eyes locking with her daughter's. It was the first verse of the soldier's lullaby. He didn't have a powerful voice. He often sang off-key, but his men said that when the general sang, it gave them more courage than any rousing speech. Because it was real. Abby reached out a trembling finger and touched the cold metal of the medal. Laura continued, her voice growing stronger. "After the war, your grandfather became a respected leader. He believed that the arts, music, stories, painting, were not luxuries for the rich. He believed they were essential for the soul of a country, a way to heal and to remember. He served on a commission that helped establish cultural institutions. And one of them was this one." Abby's head snapped up. "What?" "Northwood Academy," Laura said, a sad, ironic smile touching her lips. "He wasn't one of the big founders, not a Vanderbilt or a Carnegie. He didn't have money to give, but he had influence and integrity. He fought to ensure that the Academy's charter included a mandate for scholarships, a promise that a portion of its seats would always be reserved for talent, regardless of background. He said, talent doesn't know a zip code." It was his legacy, a legacy that men like Julian Croft have long since forgotten, buried under piles of donor money and celebrity. She closed the journal and took Abby's hands in her own. Her grip was firm, anchoring. "So you see, you don't just belong in this place, Abby. A piece of it belongs to you. It was built on the ideals of a man whose blood runs in your veins. That song you sing is not just some dusty old lullaby. It is the anthem of a hero. It is the foundation of this very place." She looked her daughter straight in the eye. "So, you will not quit. You will not let that arrogant, empty man and his cheap laughter have the final word. But you will not sing his song, either. That was a trap, meant to make you fail and prove him right. You will walk onto that stage at the finals. You will stand there, the granddaughter of General William Hayes. And you will sing our song. You will sing it for every person who has ever been told they are not enough. You sing it to remind them all what this place was supposed to be about. You sing it to honor your grandfather." Abby stared at her mother, seeing her not just as the tired woman who cleaned floors, but as a fierce guardian of a legacy she never knew she had. The shame and humiliation that had crushed her began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning ember of purpose. The fight wasn't about winning a prize anymore. It was about claiming her birthright. "Okay, Mom," she whispered, a single tear rolling down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of resolve. "I'll sing for him." The days leading up to the final were thick with tension. The story of Julian Croft's public challenge had spread like wildfire. The Academy was divided. Most students sided with Isabella, seeing Abby as an embarrassment, an unqualified interloper who was ruining the prestige of the competition. The media, catching wind of the rags-to-riches narrative, began to feature Abby in their preliminary articles, often with a patronizing tone, calling her the Cinderella soprano. Julian Croft, in an interview with a major music magazine, fanned the flames. When asked about Abigail Hayes, he responded with a cool smile. "The competition is about finding the future of music," he said. "We need an artist with range, with technical mastery, with a modern sensibility. While historical sentiment is charming, it doesn't sell out arenas." The message was clear. Abby was the past. He was looking for the future. Isabella was in her element. She paraded through the halls, flanked by her entourage, talking loudly about her final performance. She had a custom-arranged pop medley, complete with a laser light show, backup dancers, and a dress that reportedly cost $20,000. She was putting on a spectacle designed to impress a superstar judge. Abby, however, retreated from the noise. She stopped caring about what anyone said. She spent her time in the quiet corners of the academy. Mr. Henderson found her one afternoon sitting by the academy's rose garden, her grandfather's journal in her lap. He didn't say much. He simply handed her a small, sepia-toned photograph in a simple wooden frame. It showed a group of young, tired-looking soldiers. In the center stood a tall, kind-eyed man who looked strikingly like her mother, General William Hayes. He always said the quietest man in the room was usually the strongest, Mr. Henderson said, his voice raspy with age. He'd be proud of you, little one. Very proud. Abby took the photograph and traced the outline of her grandfather's face. She spent hours reading his journal, absorbing his words about courage, humility, and the simple beauty of a song sung with an honest heart. She wasn't just learning about a hero, she was meeting her family. She practiced, but not in the way the other students did. She didn't drill scales or work with a metronome. She would go to the empty auditorium late at night, when the only light was a single, dim, ghost light on the stage. She would stand there and simply talk to her grandfather, telling him about her day, about her fears, about her mother. And then, she would sing his song. She sang it over and over, not to perfect the notes, but to deepen her connection to its meaning. With every repetition, the song became more a part of her. It was in her breath, in her blood. She wasn't a little girl performing a song anymore. She was a storyteller, sharing a sacred history. On the night of the finals, a nervous energy crackled through the Northwood Academy of Music. Limousines lined the long, winding driveway. The auditorium was filled to capacity with the elite of the music world, record executives, famous musicians, critics, and the wealthy patrons of the Academy. The stage was a dazzling display of lights and technology. Backstage was a flurry of activity. Stylists fussed over Isabella's hair, and choreographers gave last-minute instructions to her dancers. Abby sat alone in a small, quiet dressing room. She wore the same simple white dress her mother had made for her. She had no makeup, no fancy hairstyle. In her hands, she clutched the old photograph of her grandfather. Laura came in just before the show started. She wasn't wearing her maid's uniform. She had on a simple but elegant navy blue dress she had bought from a secondhand store years ago and saved for a special occasion. She looked beautiful and proud. She knelt in front of her daughter and straightened the collar of her dress. She didn't offer any last-minute advice. She didn't need to. "I'm in the third row, on the aisle," she said, her voice steady. "When you look out, you won't be able to see me because of the lights. But I'll be there, and he will be, too." She kissed Abby's forehead. "I love you, my brave girl." As Abby waited in the wings for her turn, she watched Isabella's performance on a monitor. It was exactly the spectacle everyone expected. The music was loud, the lights were blinding, the dancing was energetic. Isabella hit every note with slick, commercial perfection. The crowd, particularly the younger members, roared with approval. When she finished, she struck a confident pose, and the applause was deafening. Julian Croft was beaming, clapping enthusiastically. This was the future he wanted. Then, it was Abby's turn. The stage manager looked at her simple dress and her empty hands with a pitying expression. "You're next, kid. Good luck." The MC, a charismatic TV host, announced her name. "And now, for our final contestant of the evening. She's captured a lot of attention with her traditional style. Please welcome Abigail Hayes." There was a smattering of polite, uncertain applause. As Abby walked out onto the enormous stage, a few whispers and soft snickers could be heard from the student section. She looked so small, so plain, so out of place amid the grandeur. She walked to the very center of the stage and stood still, waiting for the whispers to die down. The stage lights were so bright they were almost painful, creating a wall of brilliance that separated her from the vast, dark sea of the audience. She couldn't see her mother. She couldn't see Mr. Henderson. All she could see was the judge's table and the bored, arrogant face of Julian Croft. He was leaning back in his chair, already looking dismissive, ready to deliver the final, killing blow to her foolish dream. He leaned into his microphone, his voice booming through the auditorium. "Miss Hayes," he began, a condescending smirk on his face. "Before you begin your lullaby, I believe we have some unfinished business. I made a rather public, and I admit, theatrical challenge to you a few weeks ago. Are you prepared to sing the aria? Are you ready for your $100 million question?" The audience chuckled. He was toying with her, turning her final moment into a piece of entertainment at her expense. Abby stood silent for a long moment, her small form holding the attention of the entire auditorium. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. She thought of her grandfather walking into enemy fire. This was nothing compared to that. She took a slow, deep breath and looked directly at Julian Croft. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was quiet, but it carried across the silent hall with perfect clarity. "No, Mr. Croft," she said. "I won't be singing your song tonight." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Julian's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "I am going to sing my grandfather's song," Abby continued, her voice gaining strength. "And his name was General William Hayes." The name landed like a thunderclap in the silent hall. In the front rows, where the oldest and most powerful patrons of the Academy sat, there were murmurs of recognition. On the walls of the main lobby, his portrait hung among the founding benefactors. Julian Croft's face went pale. The history he had so arrogantly dismissed was suddenly staring him in the face. Abby closed her eyes. She didn't need to see him anymore. She didn't need to see any of them. She was in a quiet field, long ago, with a good man who was afraid, but who sang anyway. And then, with all the love, all the history, and all the quiet courage in her blood, she began to sing. "The sun sinks low behind the hill." The first line was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to physically push back the dazzling, overwhelming glare of the stage lights. It was a sound of such profound, unadorned honesty that it instantly silenced the restless shuffling and coughing in the auditorium. It was not a performance. It was a confession. The shadows stretch, the air grows still. Abby's voice didn't try to fill the cavernous space with volume. Instead, it created an intimate one. She wove a spell of quiet reverence, drawing every person in the hall closer, as if they were all gathered around a small, flickering campfire on a vast, dark plain. The intricate light show that had dazzled for Isabella was gone, replaced by a single, soft, golden spotlight that fell on Abby, making her blonde hair shine like a halo. It was an accident, a default setting the technicians hadn't bothered to change, but it looked like a benediction. She sang of a soldier's weariness, the ache in his bones, the mud on his boots. She sang of his longing for a home he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. The notes were simple, the melody as old as the hills, but her delivery was devastatingly pure. In her voice, the audience heard not a polished artist, but the echo of 1,000 forgotten goodbyes whispered at train stations, the silent prayers of mothers for their children, the universal human ache for peace and safety. In the third row, Laura Hayes sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Tears streamed freely down her face, but she made no sound. She was listening with her entire being, hearing not just her daughter, but her father, her own history, their family's quiet, unbreakable strength made manifest in song. A few rows behind her, Mr. Henderson, dressed in a simple, clean suit he'd owned for 30 years, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. He saw the face of his young commander, a man who led with kindness and courage, humming this very tune in the terrifying quiet before a battle. The two judges beside Julian Croft were no longer adjudicators. They were captives. The female judge, a renowned opera singer herself, had her hand over her heart, her meticulously applied makeup ruined by a stream of silent tears. The other judge, a shrewd record producer known for his cynical and commercial eye, stared at the stage, his mouth slightly agape, his pen lying forgotten on the table. He had spent his life searching for the next big thing, the next marketable sound. And here it was, in the form of a 10-year-old girl and a song that was 100 years old. He wasn't hearing a product. He was hearing truth. But all of Abby's focus, all the emotional force of her song, was an arrow aimed at one person, Julian Croft. He had started his lean back in his chair, a posture of supreme arrogance and boredom. But as the song progressed, he slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to sit up straighter. His smirk had vanished, his face stripped bare of its practiced, cynical mask. He was no longer Julian Croft, the global superstar. He was Julian Koprowski, the son of Polish immigrants who had scrimped and saved every penny from their work in factories to pay for his first piano lessons. He was the boy who had attended Northwood on a scholarship, terrified and out of place, constantly mocked for his second-hand clothes and his unrefined accent. He remembered the burning shame of it, the desperate, all-consuming hunger to prove them all wrong, to become so rich and so powerful that no one could ever laugh at him again. Abby's song bypassed the fortress of fame and wealth he had built around himself for decades. It spoke directly to the lonely, scared boy inside. It reminded him of the very thing he had sacrificed at the altar of his ambition, authenticity. He had spent his life mastering the art of the perfect sound, but he had forgotten the importance of an honest one. He looked at Abby, this small, fearless girl, and for the first time in years, he felt a profound and sickening shame. He had used his immense power to humiliate a child who possessed the very thing he had lost. Sleep, my soldier, battles cease. Dream of home, and find your peace. The final notes hung in the air, as delicate and fragile as a spider's thread, yet as strong as steel. They shimmered in the vast silence, holding thousands of people in a shared, breathless moment of profound emotion. Abby lowered her head, her part of the story told. For a full 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. Not the awkward silence of confusion, but the sacred silence of a congregation after a prayer. It was a silence so complete, so heavy with feeling, that no one dared to break it. Then, from the third row, a single person began to clap. It was Laura Hayes, rising slowly to her feet, her face a beautiful, tear-streaked mask of love and pride. Her solitary applause echoed in the stillness. Then another person stood, and another. Mr. Henderson, the judge who was a producer. A famous rock star in the fifth row. A hardened music critic who hadn't given a standing ovation in a decade. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause that erupted was not the polite, enthusiastic clapping for Isabella. It was a roar. It was a tidal wave of emotion, a thundering, cathartic release of gratitude and awe. People were not just clapping. They were cheering, shouting bravo, some openly weeping. They weren't just applauding a song. They were applauding courage. They were applauding history. They were applauding the defiant, beautiful triumph of the human spirit. Backstage, Isabella Montgomery watched the monitor, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her perfectly produced spectacle, her expensive dress, her backup dancers, all of it had been erased from memory by a little girl in a homemade dress singing a folk song. She had offered them a firework display, but Abby had shown them the stars. On the stage, Abby finally lifted her head, her blue eyes wide with astonishment as she took in the sight of thousands of people on their feet, their faces turned towards her, their hands creating a thunderous storm of approval. A slow, shy smile spread across her face. In that moment, she understood. Her grandfather had been right. Her mother had been right. A true voice, a voice that speaks from the heart, could be more powerful than any army. The judges were in chaos. The two moved judges were still on their feet, clapping wildly. Julian Croft, however, remained seated. He was pale, shaken, looking at the small girl on the stage as if seeing a ghost. The roar of the crowd was a judgment on him, and he knew it. Finally, the MC came back on stage, his own professional composure rattled. He had to shout to be heard over the din. Let's hear it for Abigail Hayes. Wow. Just wow. It took several minutes for the applause to die down. When a semblance of order was restored, the three judges were huddled together, talking in urgent, hushed tones. The camera zoomed in on their faces. Julian was shaking his head, arguing, but the other two were resolute, their expressions firm. The producer judge pointed a finger at the audience, then back at the stage, as if to say, "Are you blind? The people have already decided." After a tense, televised deliberation that felt like an eternity, they broke apart. The MC walked to the center of the stage, a golden envelope in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, the judges have reached a verdict," he announced, his voice filled with drama. "This year's winner of the Elite Voice Challenge the recipient of a full scholarship to Northwood Academy and $100 million in sponsorships, is... He paused, opening the envelope. The auditorium held its collective breath. Abigail Hayes. The explosion of sound was even greater than before. Confetti cannons erupted, showering the stage in glittering gold and silver. Abby stood frozen, the words not quite registering. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. Laura Hayes let out a sob of pure joy, collapsing back into her seat, her body trembling. But then, the MC held up a hand. Wait, ladies and gentlemen, there's more. The judges have made a second, unprecedented announcement. He read from another card. Due to his conduct during this competition, which the board of Northwood Academy has deemed to be contrary to the founding principles of this institution, principles championed by one of our forgotten founders, General William Hayes, Mr. Julian Croft has been asked to step down from his position as judge and will be severing his official ties with the Academy, effective immediately. A wave of shocked gasps swept through the hall. Julian Croft's face, projected onto the giant screens, was a picture of pure, unfiltered shock and humiliation. He had been publicly dethroned. The king had been toppled by the maid's daughter. The statement continued. Furthermore, in honor of the spirit of this evening, the Academy is proud to announce the creation of a new, permanent scholarship in the name of General William Hayes, to be awarded annually to a student who demonstrates exceptional soulfulness and emotional honesty in their music. The first recipient is Miss Abigail Hayes. It was more than a victory. It was a revolution. In the ensuing chaos, as Abby was mobbed by well-wishers and the press, she looked past the flashing cameras and the outstretched hands, searching for the one person she needed to see. She finally saw her mother making her way through the crowd, her face shining. They met in the middle of the stage, under the glittering confetti, and threw their arms around each other. You did it, Laura whispered into her daughter's hair. You brought him home. A little while later, as the crowds began to thin, Abby felt a light touch on her shoulder. She turned to see Julian Croft. He looked smaller, diminished, without his aura of power. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a weary, haunted look. His security detail stood a few feet away, looking awkward. He started, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. Your performance, it was... He couldn't seem to find the right words. He looked down at the floor, then back at her, his eyes filled with a strange, regretful light. You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago, he said finally, his voice quiet. Thank you. He didn't offer an apology for his cruelty, not in words. But the shame in his eyes was apology enough. He gave a small, stiff nod, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the wings, a fallen idol leaving his own temple. The next morning, the story was on the front page of every newspaper, on every morning talk show. The soul of Northwood, Maid's daughter topples a titan. The narrative was irresistible. The underdog, the forgotten hero, the arrogant celebrity, the triumphant return of forgotten values. Abigail Hayes was no longer the Cinderella soprano. She was a national hero. A few weeks later, Abby and Laura moved out of the small staff apartment. They didn't move into a mansion. At Laura's insistence, they bought a modest, comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood a few miles from the academy. It had a small garden, which Laura had always dreamed of. The $100 million was placed into a trust, managed by a team of lawyers and financial advisors assembled by the now adoring Academy Board. Abby started at Northwood as a full-time student. She didn't have a crystal dress or a famous last name, but she walked the halls with a quiet confidence that no one dared to question. The other students, even Isabella, now treated her with a mixture of awe and respect. She had done something none of them could have done. She hadn't just won a competition. She had changed the entire culture of the school. She took piano lessons and studied music theory, but her greatest teacher remained her grandfather's journal. She never sang the Italian aria. Instead, she began writing her own songs. They were simple songs, like his. Songs about ordinary people, about quiet acts of courage, about the love between a mother and a daughter. One sunny afternoon in spring, Abby sat in her mother's new garden. Laura was tending to her roses, humming a familiar tune. Abby had her guitar, a gift from the record producer Judge, and a notebook. She was working on a new song. The final verse was about a little girl, standing on a big stage, singing a song for a hero she had never met, and in doing so, finally finding her own voice. It was a voice that would go on to touch millions, not because of its technical perfection, but because it always sang the truth. And in a world full of noise, that was the most valuable sound of all. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.